The grand courtroom, filled with murmuring spectators, falls into silence as the clerk announces the next case. The sound of shuffling papers and the faint click of a judge's gavel tapping lightly against wood fills the air. Case number 2467. The State versus James Carter. At the defense table, 12-year-old James Carter sits stiffly, his hands tightly clenched into fists. His oversized jacket, frayed at the sleeves, swallows his small frame. His deep brown eyes dart around nervously, but his expression isn't just fear, it's something deeper, something unreadable. Across from him, the prosecutor stands with an air of arrogance, flipping lazily through his file. Your Honor, this boy is a repeat offender. No parents, no legal guardian, caught stealing from a grocery store. Frankly, it's time we stopped giving him second chances and placed him in juvenile detention where he belongs. Judge Vanessa Williams exhales as she scans the paperwork. A black woman in her early 40s, she's built a reputation for fairness, but as she looks at the boy, something tugs at her. Something familiar. She looks up, her sharp eyes meeting his. Do you understand the charges against you? James doesn't answer right away. He just stares at her. Not with fear, not with defiance, but with a strange, quiet certainty. Then, in a voice so steady it sends chills through the room, he says, "You're my mother." Gasps ripple through the courtroom. The stenographer's fingers freeze over her keyboard. The prosecutor's smirk vanishes. Judge Williams' grip slackens, her gavel slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the bench. Her breath catches in her throat. "What did you just say?" she whispers, her voice barely audible. James doesn't blink. His lips tremble slightly, but his voice holds steady. "You're my mother." The room is now dead silent. Eyes dart between the boy and the judge, disbelief painted across every face. For the first time in her career, Judge Vanessa Williams feels completely unprepared. A wave of whispers sweeps through the courtroom like wildfire. Reporters furiously scribble notes, cameras clicking as they capture the stunned expressions on every face. The bailiff shifts uneasily, eyeing the judge for instructions. The prosecutor scoffs, throwing his hands in the air. "Objection! This is an outrageous attempt at manipulation. This boy is lying to gain sympathy from the court." But Judge Vanessa Williams doesn't hear him. Her ears are ringing, her pulse pounding. She can't look away from the boy who just called her mother. James straightens in his seat, his voice louder now, unwavering. "You're my mother. I know you are." Her fingers dig into the bench as if anchoring herself to reality. "This is impossible," she whispers, more to herself than anyone else. But James doesn't falter. Slowly, he reaches into the pocket of his oversized jacket and pulls out a small, crumpled photograph. He unfolds it carefully, smoothing it out before holding it up for her to see. Gasps ripple through the courtroom. The faded picture is unmistakable. A much younger Vanessa Williams, her arms wrapped around a newborn baby. Her face filled with exhaustion, yet glowing with an emotion too raw to fake. A gavel falls to the floor. Judge Williams' hands tremble as she reaches for the photograph, her breath catching in her throat. She barely hears the murmurs growing louder around her. That can't be real. Is it possible? Did she abandon her own child? Her heart clenches as her gaze flicks from the picture to the boy's outstretched hand. And there, on his small wrist, the birthmark, the same tiny crescent-shaped birthmark she had traced with her fingers 12 years ago. The air is sucked from her lungs. The world tilts, because she knows. This isn't a hoax. James Carter is her son, the child she gave up for adoption 12 years ago, the child she thought she'd never see again. Tears blur her vision as she grips the photograph. But before she can speak, the courtroom explodes into chaos. Judge Williams's heart pounds in her chest, each beat echoing like a hammer striking steel. Her mind races back to a time she had buried deep within her past, The cold, sterile hospital room, the weight of her newborn son in her arms, the unbearable pain of signing the adoption papers. She had been only 18, a struggling law student with no money, no family support, and no idea how to raise a child. They had assured her he would go to a loving home. They had told her it was the best thing for him. But now, her son stood before her, alone, abandoned, and accused of being a criminal. Her voice is barely above a whisper, but it cuts through the silence like a blade. "Where have you been all these years?" James lifts his chin, his small frame trembling, but his voice is steady, fueled by something deeper than fear. "I was supposed to be adopted, but no one wanted me." Gasps ripple through the room. The prosecutor shifts uncomfortably, sensing that this case is no longer just another open and shut juvenile delinquent trial. Judge Williams's fingers curl around the edges of the photograph, her stomach twisting with dread. "They said I was too old, too much trouble," James continues, his jaw clenched. "I was shuffled between foster homes and group homes. Some were okay, some were awful, but I always had this picture. I always knew you were out there somewhere." His voice cracks slightly, but his eyes never leave hers. Judge Williams grips the bench, her carefully built composure crumbling around her. Every word he speaks is a dagger straight to her soul. She had spent years building her career, making sure that justice was served, believing that she had done what was right all those years ago. But James had suffered. Her James. Tears burn at the edges of her vision, but she blinks them back. She is a judge. She cannot fall apart in front of an entire courtroom. James steps forward, his small fists clenched, his voice sharper now. "So tell me, Your Honor, do I still deserve to be thrown away?" The weight of his words crashes over her like a tidal wave. The entire courtroom is breathless, waiting for her response. Judge Williams swallows the lump in her throat. She has to make a choice. The courtroom remains deathly silent for what feels like an eternity. The air is thick with shock, disbelief, and something else, an emotion so raw and heavy it presses down on every person in the room. The prosecutor, sensing that the entire case is slipping through his fingers, clears his throat loudly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is absurd. This boy is a criminal. He has a record. We recommend immediate sentencing." Judge Williams snaps her gaze to him, and for the first time in her career, the controlled steel in her eyes has been replaced by something fiery, something deeply personal. "This hearing is over," she declares, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "All charges against James Carter are dropped." A stunned silence grips the room. The prosecutor stumbles, scrambling for a counter-argument. "But enough!" Judge Williams roars, her gavel slamming down with such force that the entire room flinches. Reporters furiously scribble notes, cameras flash, and whispers break out across the packed courtroom. She turns back to James, her stern judicial mask finally cracking. The weight of 12 lost years crashes over her in waves. She had thought she was making the right decision back then. But looking at him now, small for his age, weary beyond his years, eyes filled with both pain and hope, she realizes she had been wrong. Her voice is softer now, barely above a whisper. "James, come here." The boy hesitates, his body rigid, as if expecting this to be some kind of cruel trick. But something in her voice, something he's been longing to hear his entire life, pulls him forward. Slowly, cautiously, he steps up to the bench. His heart pounds so loudly in his chest, he swears the entire courtroom can hear it. And then, for the first time in 12 years, Judge Vanessa Williams does something she never imagined she'd do in a courtroom. She reaches out and pulls her son into her arms. A collective gasp sweeps through the room. Some wipe away tears. Others break into quiet applause. The cameras capture it all. The judge, who just moments ago held the gavel of justice, now holding her long-lost child. James stiffens at first, unaccustomed to warmth, to affection. But then his small frame relaxes. For the first time in as long as he can remember, he feels safe. He had spent his life being discarded, forgotten, and unloved. But today, standing in the arms of the mother who had never truly stopped searching for him, he had finally been found. The sound of hurried footsteps echoes through the courthouse as reporters scramble outside, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in excitement. The story of the decade is unfolding before their eyes, and they don't intend to miss a second of it. Judge's long-lost son, found in courtroom. Boy faces judge and discovers she's his mother. Justice or destiny, mother and son reunite in court. Inside the courtroom, the tension has shifted. The gasps have turned into murmurs, the murmurs into awe. No one can quite believe what they've just witnessed. But one person isn't clapping. The prosecutor, his face red with fury, storms toward the judge's bench, his hands balled into fists. "You can't do this," he hisses, his voice low but seething with frustration. "You can't just drop a case because of personal matters. This is favoritism." Judge Williams slowly lifts her gaze to meet his, and for the first time in her career, she doesn't just look at him as a fellow officer of the law. She looks at him as a mother. As a woman who has just realized the system she swore to uphold has been failing children like her own son for years. She stands, her robe billowing slightly, as she levels him with a stare so cold, so full of authority, that the entire courtroom falls silent again. "Favoritism," she repeats, her voice sharp as a blade. "Number justice." James watches, his heart pounding, as his mother, the woman who gave him life, the woman he never thought he'd meet, does something he never expected. She fights for him. She places a firm hand on his shoulder before turning back to the prosecutor. "A system that lets children like him fall through the cracks is broken," she continues, her voice carrying through the courtroom with undeniable power. "And I won't let it happen again." The prosecutor stares at her, lost for words. Judge Williams turns to her clerk, her mind already made up. "I want a full report on every child currently in the juvenile system without proper legal representation. I want to know who they are, where they are, and what brought them into this courtroom. And I want it by the end of the week." A ripple of shock spreads through the courtroom. The clerk nods quickly, scrambling to make notes. Judge Williams isn't just saving one boy today, she's about to change the entire system. The room erupts into applause. Lawyers, reporters, spectators, even the bailiff. They clap because they know they're witnessing something historic. A moment that won't just be a headline, it will be a movement. James looks up at her, his throat tight with emotion. She squeezes his shoulder gently. "You are not a mistake, and you are not alone anymore." For the first time in years, James smiles, because this time, justice isn't just being served, it's being rewritten. That night, James sits at the dining table of his mother's home for the first time. The aroma of a home-cooked meal lingers in the air, something he hasn't experienced in years. His fingers trace the wooden surface, taking in the warmth of a place that already feels different from anywhere he's ever been. The fridge is full. The house is warm. The couch is soft. And for the first time in his life, he feels safe. Judge Williams watches him quietly from across the table, a small, uncertain smile on her face. She's spent years making decisions for others, dictating justice with unwavering authority. But right now, she feels like she's standing at the edge of something unknown, something fragile yet deeply important. Between them, on the table, rests the faded photograph James had carried all these years. Her younger self, holding him as a baby, frozen in time. She reaches for it, her fingers trembling slightly. "I never stopped thinking about you," she whispers, her voice barely above a breath. "I just didn't know where to look." James looks up at her, his tough exterior cracking just a little. I just wanted to know if you ever cared. His voice is quiet, almost scared to ask. Judge Williams exhales deeply, then gently takes his hand in hers. More than you'll ever know. James swallows hard, blinking back tears. For years he convinced himself he didn't need anyone, that he was fine on his own. But here, in this moment, sitting beside the woman he had spent his whole life wondering about, something inside him shifts. He doesn't have to fight alone anymore. He doesn't have to fight at all. Silence settles over them, but it's not heavy. It's peaceful. For the first time, the weight of the past isn't suffocating. It's lifting. Judge Williams squeezes his hand, offering a quiet, steady presence. James exhales, his shoulders loosening as he leans his head against her shoulder. She doesn't move, doesn't speak. She just lets him be. And for the first time in 12 years, they both know. They are finally home.